If you said I was a stupid husband and I wouldn't argue with you. Let's just say that I was an ignorant husband, a happy but ignorant husband. I thought I had it all, 2 great children under the age of 5, a wonderful golden retriever, a great job, a great house, but most of all an absolute angel of a wife, Lynn. We met 5 years ago, when we were both about 25. We met a week after she moved to Philadelphia from someplace in Texas. It was a whirlwind romance. 3 days later she moved in with me, and 3 months later we married. I know that it was quick, but I never believed that a woman that beautiful would ever want to date me, much less marry me. She said that she was turned on by my sense of humor. I wrote advertising copy for a local ad agency. I had won several awards for my work and made a good living. Once or twice a year I did stand-up comedy at banquets hosted by my company for all the employees and clients. Lynn was an orphan with no family, not even aunts, uncles, or cousins. She couldn't bear to discuss what it was like growing up in an orphanage and foster homes, and I never pressed her on that subject or anything about her horrible childhood. I was counting my blessings as I wheeled the trash cans from my backyard out to the street for tomorrow's pickup, only to run into my crazy neighbor Sabrina, who was a real pain in the neck as she marched over to me with a sneer on her face. I was steeling myself for her latest rant, but later, I would be eternally grateful to Sabrina, my crazy next-door neighbor. She goes through my trash and others on our block and yells at us if we don't recycle every single item that's supposed to be recycled. Sometimes I just throw it all into the trash can, soda bottles and all, and she raises hell with me. She's in her late 80s, and I don't want to yell back at her and give her a heart attack. I push the trash can to the street next to the can for recyclables and return to my backyard to bring out the can for grass and leaves, only to find Sabrina up on her hind legs ready to pounce. She pointed to the open recycle bin and asked why I was putting used condom wrappers in there instead of in the trash container. She used a stick to poke around and showed me a half-dozen wrappers and some used condoms. She argued that the people who sort through the recyclables shouldn't have to deal with my used condoms. I was shocked. I had a vasectomy after our second child was born. Whose condoms were those? This evidence seemed to incriminate my wife. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't figure out how someone would put them in my trash can if they hadn't used them in my house. I went to the kitchen and retrieved a plastic bag into which, with a stick, I deposited the used condoms. I wanted to know whose DNA they identified. I promised Sabrina that I would be more meticulous in the future. I must be the most clueless husband on earth. I hadn't had a clue that my wife was cheating on me. Actually, I still didn't have any proof, but maybe that's only because I hadn't been looking. Looking back, I now realized that my wife hadn't initiated intimacy with me for months and just lay there when I tried to be loving with her. I went back inside and tried to nonchalantly look around for any clues, but truthfully, I had no idea what I was looking for. I checked my wife's nightstand for condoms, but found none. That night after my wife went to sleep, I tried to access her cell phone, but discovered that now it was locked. It had never before been locked. That was suspicious, but didn't prove anything. The next day, with heightened awareness, I saw that my wife never left her cell phone out of her possession. At dinner, the kids' faces were covered with whipped cream, and I saw my chance. I asked my wife, who was at the sink, to give me her phone so that I could photograph the kids' whipped cream-filled faces. She hemmed and hawed, but finally acceded to my repeated requests. She unlocked the phone but hovered over me as I took some photos. I asked her why her phone was now password protected, and she said it was to keep the kids from playing video games on it. I told her that was a wise idea, but since I wouldn't be playing games, she should give me the password. She said that she would, but first had to go to the bathroom. She took her phone and I assumed she was busy erasing any incriminating evidence. While she was there, I went to the fridge to get one of my homebrewed beers. There were 4 inside. There should have been 6. My wife hates beer, so I knew that she didn't drink any. Apparently, the man who used the condoms and used my wife also used my beer. The next day, I went to a spy store downtown and bought some voice-activated recorders to hide around the house. I also placed a motion-activated video camera facing our bed and another facing the downstairs couch. I didn't put any in the kids' rooms. I couldn't imagine my wife would stoop that low. I sent my DNA plus the DNA in the condoms to a nationally known DNA database. The tests indicated that my wife's lover was related to me, but I didn't know his name. That night, as my wife slept, I took her phone and found the file for deleted messages. Son of a witch, she was having an affair with my cousin Alan. They met up twice a week in our house. I would fix that son of a bitch. I also discovered that Lynn was talking about murdering me. They would drug me with the date assault drug, then she and Alan would claim that I fell off our small motorboat while we were fishing in the ocean and drowned. After that, she and Alan could live life large with my life insurance. Alan had always been my nemesis. As children, he would always bully me and his other cousins, but my parents claimed that they didn't believe me and never made him stop. He goaded me over that and called me a sissy. He was 4 years older and a lot bigger and tougher than I was. On more than one occasion, he beat the crap out of me just for his amusement. My parents did nothing to stop him. I knew he would beat the crap out of me if I ever tried to fight him fairly. One night as he had dinner at my house, as my parents were in the kitchen, he punched me in the stomach. Without any hesitation, I took my steak knife and chased him around the dining room, threatening to kill him as tears streamed down my face. He wasn't taunting me, but screaming for my parents to save him. My parents were aghast, took the knife away from me, and made me apologize for scaring Alan. They didn't believe in self-defense, I guess. My dad worked for his brother-in-law, Alan's father, and that's why Alan could do no wrong and my parents wouldn't stand up for me. The bullying didn't stop until I left for college. Now we're adults, he's still a bully, but I had no need to fight him fairly. Now, I would fight to win whatever the cost, and whatever I had to do, not just for him sleeping with my wife, but for a lifetime of bullying me. Payback time would soon arrive, and it would be vicious. Of course, the first thing I did was to change the beneficiaries on my life insurance to my children in a trust, managed by my best friend and cousin Jerry. At dinner, my wife talked about a fishing excursion with me in the next week or two. I acted agreeable to the idea. I was very careful about what I ate or drank at home after that. 2 days later, I watched the video of them having sex in my bed and denigrating me. They delighted in making me a cuck. Alan was no better looking than I was. He was more successful, but only because his father owned the business where he and my father worked. He was in a lot worse physical shape with at least an extra 50 pounds in his stomach, which poured over and hit his belt. I held in my anger. I wasn't going to get even. I was going to annihilate him. I decided that there was no hope of reconciling with my wife now that I knew she wanted to kill me. The sight of her naked with my arch enemy turned all my love into hatred. Once again, he drank my home-brewed beer, claimed that it was the best beer in town, and brewing it was all I was good for, to which my wife agreed. I decided that would be his downfall. I would poison him. I arranged for my doctor to give me a prescription for 3 months of Viagra. I threw away the last of the beer and brewed another batch of beer and put enough Viagra into each bottle to give a racehorse a non-stop 7-day excitement or an overweight man a heart attack. It was well over the dangerous level, especially since you shouldn't mix Viagra with alcohol. I placed the rest of the pills in their box on the bathroom counter. That day, I left work early and waited down the street in my car until I heard a siren as an ambulance raced down my street. I ran to my house, and as I opened the door, the paramedics were wheeling a fat, naked man out on a gurney. I ran over and recognized my cousin and yelled at him, asking why he was naked in my house. He didn't answer. He was alive and breathing with an oxygen mask. "You're going to die, fatso," I taunted him. Was being intimate with my wife worth dying for? You piece of shit? Then I saw my wife, who seemed naked under the bathrobe she wore. I didn't say a word to her. I learned that Alan had his heart attack while, so to speak, in the saddle and collapsed on top of my wife. His weight broke 2 of her ribs. It took her some time to wiggle out from under the fat slob. She thought she would be suffocated and was in shock. After the ambulance left with both Alan and my wife, I removed and destroyed all the tainted beer bottles, but took my package of Viagra from the bathroom counter and placed it in my pocket. That night, wearing rubber examination gloves, I visited Alan in his hospital room. He was hooked up to a ventilator. Oxygen flowed through a flexible plastic tube into his mouth. He looked up and saw me. He tried to press the nurse call button, but I took it out of his hand. I put his fingerprints on my box of Viagra. He was now sweating. "Are you scared?" I asked. "Well, you should be." I squeezed the rubber tubing so that the oxygen stopped flowing for a moment. He wheezed, and then I released the tube so he could again breathe. I did it twice more, and he was mouthing the words, "Please don't." I laughed at him and told him that I would return later to finish the job. Then I left his room and went to visit my wife. She was gazing at the ceiling and didn't acknowledge my entrance. I told her how unhappy I was that Alan hadn't crushed her to death like she deserved. She heard me and started crying. I never returned to the hospital. I went home, placed the Viagra box with his fingerprints on the bathroom counter. I had to find my children. They were staying with my parents. My parents knew what my wife had been up to with Alan and had been covering for them. My father still worked for Alan's father, and that's where his loyalty lay. I went over there and told my parents what really happened. I also said they should have let me kill Alan when we were children, or at least they could have stood up for me. Now he was half dead and I couldn't be happier. I told them to take one last look at their grandchildren because they would never again see them. I phoned Alan's parents and gloated how their son nearly died screwing my wife. I think that's his karma. I told them how grateful I was that my father warned me what Alan was doing at my house, which was a complete lie designed to get my father fired from his job. I guess you never taught Alan not to take what wasn't his. If he dies, it's your fault. Alan didn't die, but he would spend the rest of his life toting a large tank of oxygen on wheels around with him. It's hard to be a ladies' man when you're an invalid. Not the best revenge, but not the worst either. 3 days later, my father phoned me and asked if it was safe for my wife to return to our house. I told him no. I had already filed for divorce. As a final foo to Alan, I hired Jerry, another one of our cousins. A cousin who Alan had also mercilessly bullied. Jerry was excited about exacting his own revenge on Alan. In addition to filing for my divorce, Jerry also sued Alan for intentional infliction of emotional distress on my behalf. Jerry, who is every bit as vengeful as I am, and had Alan served in his hospital room while Alan's parents were present. Once again, he went into cardiac arrest, but the doctors once again saved him. This was fun. Alan claimed that he never took the Viagra and had been poisoned. His fingerprints on the package convinced the police that he was lying. In truth, based on the number of pills that I knew should have been in the package, I knew that he had indeed taken some of the pills, which was further proven because when he was admitted, the hospital pumped his stomach and found the residue of the pills. My wife caught COVID in the hospital. Unfortunately, it didn't kill her, but she did suffer through a lot of pain for several weeks. If you are healthy, a hospital is the last place you want to be. It's a petri dish for bacteria, viruses, and a multitude of diseases. With her low immunity, she caught something called Clostridioides difficile, or C. diff. It's highly contagious and highly dangerous. She had to remain in the hospital for another 10 days. Her karma had bitten her in the butt once again. My children didn't understand why their mother didn't return home when the hospital finally released her, and I was at a loss to explain it to them in an age-appropriate manner. I just said that she needed a timeout, and that seemed to satisfy them a little. It was a little late in the game, but I hired a private eye to find some dirt on my wife and her affair with Alan, though I thought that the EMT's report was proof enough of adultery. I read his report just an hour before my first court hearing with Lynn. I was drinking some water, and I did a spit take, getting all the papers in my lawyer's hands wet. I gave him the report, and he almost fell off his chair. When my wife took the stand, the bailiff asked for her name. She said she was Mrs. Lynn Eddy. My lawyer objected, which confused the judge. My lawyer said that calling herself Mrs. assumed facts, not in evidence. The judge seemed puzzled until my lawyer asked to approach the bench. He handed the judge the file that we had just received. The judge, a young woman, no more than 35, leaned back in her chair and laughed as she handed the file to my wife's attorney. She addressed my wife, asking what her birth name was. Lynn responded that her maiden name was Meltzer. "Were you ever known as Lynn Cooper?" the judge asked. My wife fainted and almost fell off the witness bench, but the bailiff caught her. The judge faced my wife's lawyer. "Do you have copies of the divorce decree between your client and her first husband?" Her lawyer was stunned and asked for a recess so he could consult with his client. The judge instructed the bailiff to handcuff my wife. The judge spoke slowly. "Mrs. Cooper, there is no evidence that you ever divorced your first husband. There is, however, an arrest warrant for you from Arizona for murder. You and your husband are accused of robbing a service station, where witnesses claim you shot and killed the attendant about 5 years ago and then disappeared. By the way, your husband is in prison for committing a felony that led to murder. The state of Arizona will be notified that you are in custody awaiting an extradition for murder." I previously thought that learning of my wife's infidelity was the low point of my life. It wasn't. The lowest possible point came that evening when I had to explain to our children that their mother was in jail and would remain there for a long time because she had done some very bad things. I held them as they cried in my arms. I didn't know if I should take them to see their mother before she left for Arizona, but they insisted and I took them. Once again, I was wrong about the lowest point of my life. That point was reached when they saw their mother behind bars in an orange uniform that had the word prisoner stamped on the back. The money I didn't have to spend on alimony, I more than spent on psychologists for my kids, and me for the next 3 years. My kids have endured enough turmoil, so I don't date. Among the many surprises that interrupted my life was the discovery that Lynn wasn't an orphan. She had a mother and father who contacted me and asked to visit with their grandchildren. They were okay people. They apologized nonstop for the life choices their daughter made. They weren't evil like their daughter. Her father was a garage mechanic and his wife worked as a secretary. My kids quickly warmed up to them, especially since we were estranged from my parents. They visit us twice a year, and twice a year we visit them. They have a married son with 3 children, so my kids are happy to now have cousins. It's nice to have family again. I'm fortunate that most days I can work out of my home and literally phone it in, or more precisely email my work in. My boss was worried that my ads were no longer the award-winning funny ads I used to write. The company values my contribution and, in an effort to get me back on track, sent my children and me to Disney World for a week. Watching my children laugh and have a great time made me realize that this was more therapeutic for all of us than a year of therapy. It was time to again start living. Once again, I can laugh and with my new advertisements, make the audience for my ads laugh. My latest commercial, which won a prestigious award, was inspired by a letter my children's mother sent to them explaining that she worked on a chain gang picking up litter on Arizona highways. My commercial was for a vacation resort in the Pocono Mountains. It begins with a bunch of people in a large office, chained to their desks and computers, working while singing Sam Cooke's immortal song, Working on the Chain Gang, as they all break free from their chains and are next seen enjoying freedom at the luxury resort, swimming and playing tennis and golf while singing another song by Sam Cooke. We're having a party. Now for the second story. I met my future second wife at a Renaissance pleasure fair about 4 years ago. I was a paid performer. I was a knight in armor, on horseback in the hourly justs. It was great fun for the participants as well as the spectators. I saw a beautiful blonde-haired woman with a long scarf tied around her neck in the audience next to the field. I pranced my horse over to her and asked my lady to place her scarf on my lance to show that I was her champion. She turned red, but as her girlfriends cheered her on, she tied the scarf to my lance. In this joust, it was agreed that I would win and unhorse my opponent. We had the reverse roles an hour ago. We charged towards each other, carefully making sure that our bolsa with lances hit only one another's shields. As agreed, my opponent fell off his horse. I raised my lance and trotted my horse over to my lady fair to return her scarf. I asked her to meet me after the show, and she agreed as her girlfriends hooped and hooped it up for us. They laughed that we were a knight and Daisy. "So, are you my knight in shining armor?" she asked. "I'd love to be," I answered. "I'm Jason, and you are?" I asked. "I'm Daisy," she responded. We walked around the fair together as young children came over to have their photo taken with me, since I was still in armor. Daisy liked that I treated each child as special and spoke to each of them for as long as they wanted. "You'll make a good father," Daisy said as she took my hand in hers. "I'm already a father," I responded, and Daisy removed her hand from mine. "I don't date married men," she said as she looked daggers at me. "I'm not married. I'm a widower. My wife died about 1.5 years ago while riding her horse in a steeplechase." Daisy quickly apologized and once again took my hand. "How old is your child?" "He's a little over 5, I answered as I took out my wallet and showed Daisy a photo of him. "He looks just like you," she noted. "I'll take that as a compliment, but he's not my biological son. I adopted him when I married his mother." "Does his biological father have custody?" "No. He vanished when he got his girlfriend pregnant in high school. I have full custody." We walked over to a space where children draw pictures or played games as they were babysat by fair employees. My son Sam ran over to hug me. I raised him up to sit on my shoulders as I instructed him to shake hands with Daisy, which he did with his normal gusto. Daisy loved children. She was a school teacher and I was an emergency medical technician, or an EMT. I was studying to become a paramedic, which was a lot more complicated and paid better. My parents had died and left me a 5-bedroom house that was too big for just Sam and me, but I loved the house too much to sell it. Daisy soon came to also love the house and often dreamt out loud about filling all the empty bedrooms with our children. A year later, after we agreed to have at least 2 children, we married. Of course, Sam was my best man. He loved wearing a tux and holding the rings. As a paramedic, my hours fluctuated wildly. Unfortunately, it had a bad effect on my marriage. Sometimes I worked the day shift, and sometimes the graveyard shift. All emergency responders and their families face these challenges, and I thought that we would get through it. As I rose in seniority, my hours would stabilize, but never be 9 to 5 every day. I worked at a hospital close to our home, and sometimes I would run home for a quick lunch or dinner with my family and then race back to work. My old house had 5 bedrooms, and my wife often spoke of filling each bedroom with our children. She said it so often that it became something of a mantra. Some days that was all she talked about. After trying unsuccessfully for several years to have a child, we were both examined by doctors and discovered that my boys didn't swim. I was sterile. Daisy was crushed as the doctor gave us the news. Daisy said all the right things to make me feel better, but I knew she didn't mean them. She couldn't hide the look of disappointment on her face. I looked into her eyes and knew she would leave me because of her strong desire, insatiable craving to have a baby. I didn't get drunk or become self-destructive. I threw myself into my work and my family, but the whole vibe in our house changed. Daisy took some more night classes to work on her master's degree and was out of the house several nights a week. There was no longer any warmth in her kisses. I felt like the biggest loser on earth. An idiot with an IQ of 70 could father a child, but I couldn't. A murderer could father children, but I, who had saved countless lives, couldn't. It seemed so unfair, but that's the way life often is. One night, when Sam was busy with his homework, I sat Daisy down for an important talk. I told her I knew how much she wanted to have a baby and said we should discuss our options. We could adopt, we could use a sperm donor, and I took her hand and kissed it, we could divorce so you can find a husband who isn't sterile. Daisy ran out of the room crying. When I tried to bring it up later, she refused to discuss the issue. She withdrew further away, and all physical intimacy stopped. We were living in hell, and I didn't know what or even if there was anything I could do to resuscitate and save my marriage the way I had resuscitated and saved so many patients in the ambulance over the years. One night at dinner, Sam nonchalantly asked if we were getting a divorce. Before I could answer, Daisy said yes. Later that night, Daisy sat down next to me on our couch while I watched ER on TV. Despite living that life, 7 days a week, ER was my favorite TV show. I guess it's like a busman's holiday. Jason, she began, I love you so much, but I'm obsessed with having a child and being married to the child's father. I have never cheated on you, but I can no longer stay married to you. There's a man at work named Larry that I'm attracted to, and he's been flirting back with me. We've had dinner a few times and gone dancing. Daisy, if he's flirting with a married woman, then by definition, he's a bum. I won't stop a divorce, but Larry's not someone upon whom you can rely. Jason, you don't know him. He's kind. He listens to me and understands me. Then she got up, ran to the bathroom and cried. We filed for divorce a few days later. The house was mine, but we split everything else 50-50ths. There was no screaming, name-calling, or bashing each other to our friends. We never revealed the cause of our breakup. I loved her too much to hurt her, and she didn't want to embarrass me. I wanted her to be happy and fulfilled, and I couldn't do it. We didn't remain friends, though she moved only a few blocks away. The thought of seeing her with another man brought me too much pain to stay in touch with her. I was a casual friend with Sandra, an attractive emergency room nurse at my hospital for years. We never discussed our personal lives with one another, except to show one another photos of our children. We didn't even flirt, but somehow there was a connection between us. When her husband died about a year ago, all the paramedics not on call went to the funeral. On the first Christmas after her husband's death, we all dropped off presents for her children at her house. Sandra cried with happiness that we cared so much for her family. The day after my divorce was final, I brought a heart attack victim to the hospital. Sandra did the intake and commented that he was another patient with a broken heart. The pain I'd felt for the divorce overcame me in a tidal wave of pain. I sat down on a chair and just cried my heart out. Sandra sat down next to me and held my hand. I cried on her shoulder, telling her how unfair life had been to me, explaining that my sterility ended my marriage, but worst of all, it took the only mother my son Sam had ever known out of his life, leaving him shattered despite being in therapy. Sandra took out her wallet and removed a photo of her family with her husband and their 3 children. As you know, husband Donnie died of a heart attack a little over a year ago. My kids and I are just drifting through life without him. This weekend I planned on taking them to the zoo. I'd love it if you and Sam would join us. Before you fall madly in love with me, I joked. Remember that I'm sterile. Sandra rubbed my back. After my last son was born, I had my tubes tied, so now I'm sterile too. I guess that makes us a perfect couple, Sandra said as she rubbed my back. That statement and her hands on me awakened feelings in my heart that I thought were dead. As I looked down, my body was telling me that the awakened feelings weren't just in my heart, but also in a part of my body a little bit lower. Somewhere in my mind, Sandra moved from the column for platonic coworker to the column for potential lover. I couldn't stop myself from smiling, and Sandra smiled back. I've watched how you take care of all your patients as you drop them off, and I've always been impressed by I guess the word is humanity. I'll be blunt. Half of the doctors here have come on to me after my husband died. The other half came on to me before he died. I turned them all down because they lack humility. That's a quality they squeeze out of people in medical school. I'm very attracted to you, and I know you're a great father to your son. You're the kind of man I want and need in my life. Let's give this a chance, she said as she leaned over to kiss me. I wasn't just starved for sex. I was starved for love and affection, and this kiss was a wake-up call for what was missing in my life. Yes, I answered, this feels so right. Let's give this a chance. At first, her kids were wary of me, but they remembered the Christmas presents I had dropped off the year before and gave me a chance. I suppose I grew on them with my corny jokes and off-pitch voice when I sang kids' songs with them. Sam took to Sandra at once. I think his need and desire for a loving mother was just as great as my need for a loving wife. One of her sons was Sam's age, so they soon became best friends after Sandra and her family moved into my house. I won't say that the kids never squabbled, but that's what kids do. I couldn't believe that for the third time in my life I was in love with a wonderful woman who felt the same way about me. We lived together for just a few months before Sam and I got down on our knees together to propose to Sandra to the delight of Sandra and her kids. We married 2 weeks later. We didn't have the time or money for a luxurious honeymoon. I borrowed a fire-engine red Mustang convertible from a friend, and we all drove to the beach for the day where we rented and continuously fell off surfboards to the constant laughter of all of us. We did a lot better at making sandcastles with the kids, who then buried my legs with sand. Despite Sandra constantly applying suntan lotion to us all, we returned home as red as the Mustang convertible we borrowed. A few months later, I was called to a supermarket in my neighborhood where a woman had gone into the final stages of labor, leaving no time to transport her to the hospital. The baby was about to come out when I arrived. I wore a mask and the mother also wore a mask, though that wasn't the part of her on which I concentrated. She was also too distracted to look at me. My partner and I delivered a healthy baby girl. There were no complications, and we transported both to the hospital to be checked out anyway. We'd done this dozens of times and it was routine. I guess I phoned it in and hadn't paid much attention to the woman because the birth had been so easy and straightforward. As Sandra processed them in, I began sneezing, so I walked 10 feet away. With people catching COVID, left and right, I didn't want to infect the mother or her infant with COVID if I had been exposed to it. Several of my coworkers had caught COVID despite all our precautions with our patients. When you're a paramedic, the occupational hazards can kill you. That's why we're almost paranoid and trying to avoid being infected or infecting others. Sandra asked for the contact information for the baby's father, and the new mother cried that her boyfriend ran off when she became pregnant. I was literally married to a knight in shining armor, but I was hell-bent on having a child and my ex-husband was sterile, so I left a great guy for a bum who flirted with me when I was still married, she said through her tears, even after my husband warned me about him. Sandra asked her if she could reconcile with her former husband. The woman took Sandra's hand. I must admit that I went to his house a few months ago to see if he would give me a second chance. I discovered that he was very happily married to the kind of beautiful wife that he deserves, and they have enough children to fill all the bedrooms in that big old house that I dreamt of filling with my children. Then she paused as tears dropped from her eyes. I'm Daisy. My ex-husband's name is Jason, but he's no longer my knight in shining armor, he's yours. Now let's listen to the third story. Lately my wife had seemed distant and despondent. At first, I attributed her malaise to empty nest syndrome as our youngest would soon leave for college. But then I suspected something more sinister because of sudden late nights at the office, or going out for drinks with the rest of her office staff, after work every Friday night. That Friday night, our youngest son had a bad upset stomach. I phoned my wife and asked her to buy some Pepto-Bismol on her way home. She explained that she was at a bar with the rest of the office gang, and would buy some before she returned home a few hours later. I asked her to buy it now and return now because our son needed it now. She told me that she couldn't leave now, and that our son would survive for a few more hours. Leave the damn bar now, buy the medicine, and help me take care of our son. She didn't answer but hung up on me. I was furious at what could be more important than the health of our child. Then I realized that there was no bar noise in the background. That's when I realized that she was cheating on me, which was horrible, but putting pleasure with her boyfriend before taking care of a sick child was unforgivable. I didn't care how excited she was. Our first duty had always been our children. I was 99% sure that Jane was cheating, but I had to be 100% sure before I did anything. I swallowed my pride and remained silent when she eventually returned home 2 hours later. My son was not as forgiving as I was, and demanded to know what was so important that she couldn't go to the pharmacy for hours to help him. The next Friday, when she called me explaining that she and the staff were going out for drinks, I told her to have a good time, but to remember that I loved her and to not do anything that would jeopardize our marriage. She called me melodramatic. She didn't know that I was parked in my car across from her office when she called me. 2 minutes later, she left the office with your basic tall and handsome gigolo who was 10 years younger than my wife. I immediately recognized him. He was John, our accountant. His office was in the same building as my wife's company. I followed them to a motel, and then I drove home. This was not the week for me to start World War III with my wife. This was a week to celebrate some major milestones in the lives of our children, and I wouldn't do anything to spoil it for them. 2 years ago, when we interviewed John to be our accountant, he indicated that he was willing to help us cheat on our taxes. I not only declined, but later told my wife that I only wanted an honest accountant, not one on his way to Sing Sing. Jane was insistent, and we hired John. Now, of course, I understood why she was so eager to hire him. I believed that if he was willing to steal for us, he wouldn't mind stealing from us. If he was willing to mess with the IRS when they could put him in prison, so why would he treat us better since there was little I could do to him? It was a whirlwind week for my wife Jane and me. Our youngest son graduated from high school. Our middle son graduated from college, and our oldest son had just graduated law school. It was time to start the next phase in my life without taking care of children every day. I was excited and I was exhausted from all the ceremonies this weekend and sat back on my reclining chair in the living room of the house we'd raised our family in for 25 years. I had a profound sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. I had arranged my work life to always have breakfast with my family and dinner at least 80% of the time. The downside to this was that I didn't earn as much money as the guys who worked until 9 p.m. every night, and half the time didn't even remember names of their children. Jane brought in 2 glasses of champagne and handed one to me. Take a drink, she suggested, or maybe ordered. I have something important to tell you. I've fallen in love with someone else, and I want a trial separation from you to decide what to do. I didn't miss a beat. Well, then feel free to move out as soon as you want. I sipped the Veuve Clicquot champagne. I don't want to move out, I want you to, she replied. I'm not going anywhere. If you want to screw someone else, you won't do it in my house while we're married. I then handed my wife divorce papers. After you sign these papers and I file for divorce, you can screw everyone you want, whenever you want. The shocked look on her face made my whole day. I don't want a divorce, Jane quickly blurted out as she drummed her fingertips on her cell phone, which rested on the table next to the champagne glass. And I don't want to be married to a woman who's in love with and intimate with someone else. How long have you been intimate with your lover? She couldn't look me in the eye and slowly whispered, 6 months. So, you want a divorce so you can marry him? I asked. I don't know. That's why I want a separation. I need to find myself. Who was the lucky guy who swept you off your feet? I inquired, even though I knew. I wanted to see if she would be honest with me. Jane didn't answer. Come on, fess up. Who is he? You don't need to know, she answered. I grabbed her cell phone. I discovered that she was recording our conversation. I pushed a few buttons and told Jane that I emailed the voice file to her parents and our 3 children and a bunch of her other contacts. Now you won't have to face anyone to tell them that you want to be a 304. I've been a good wife and mother all these years. How could you embarrass me like that? She cried. If you're ashamed of what you said, you shouldn't have said it. Then I looked at her recent calls and messages. Every entry had a full name, but one was just listed by initials, JJ. John James was our family accountant. I hit redial and John answered the phone, saying, hello, sweetheart, have you told your idiot husband yet? Jane hid her face in her hands. John, this is Rob, Jane's husband. If I ever hear of you so much as speaking to my wife, I'll taser you then when you're on the ground. I'll smash your balls with my steel toe boots. Do you understand? Yes, he stammered. I want you to tell Jane that it's over between you and you'll never see her again, or I'm coming after you. I'll get a restraining order against you, Rob screamed. That's okay. They'll glue it to your tombstone, I said softly and hung up. I turned to my wife. You'd better hurry to be intimate with your boyfriend's Johnson, while he still has it. Jane ran out of the room crying and calling me an animal. She was right. I remembered the first time I had champagne with my wife. It was our first date. Most girls expect to be taken to an expensive restaurant on a first date. I didn't feel that way. I tried to be more imaginative than that. I took Jane to a local family-owned delicatessen. I had arranged with the owner to reserve a table. It was set up with an expensive tablecloth and candelabra on the table, along with 3 bottles of expensive wine. Jane thought it was a great idea, and the evening went well for both of us. In case you're curious, pastrami goes well with Dom Perignon champagne or a Chateauneuf du Pape, while Cabernet Sauvignon complements a corned beef sandwich with a side of potato salad. After my wife of 25 years bombshell, I sat back in my recliner and tried to figure out where it all went wrong. I was set on getting revenge on my wife and her lover. I knew how to hurt my wife without getting arrested. I phoned a bunch of credit card companies and canceled all her cards. Then I went online and moved all the money from our joint saving and checking accounts to my children's college trust account. I own a small but profitable real estate company. We managed a few small office buildings and a small strip mall. I have 3 full-time employees, one of whom is my sister. In a divorce, my wife would get half of the business, but only if there still was a business to divide. That was only the beginning of my revenge. I still had some codeine cough medicine from a bad cold I had last year. I made my wife a smoothie before she began her 40-minute drive to work, but this time I placed a lot of codeine in the smoothie. It would need about 20 minutes to take effect. I got in my car and followed her. I waited until she began weaving in and out of traffic, and I phoned 911 to report a drunk driver. I followed for another 5 minutes until she was pulled over. At the officer's demand, she exited the car and fell on her face, barely able to stand. She was arrested and taken to jail where a drug and alcohol test showed she had a great deal of codeine in her system. She phoned me, but I didn't answer. She left a voicemail begging me to bail her out of jail. I didn't respond. 3 months later, my wife, after she served her 30-day sentence for drug driving, her lover and her attorney and I and my attorney stood in front of a judge who ended our marriage. My wife got the house and half of my business instead of alimony. I got my car and the loan on her car and had to pay her mortgage. Both the car, the house, and their loans were now in her name. 2 months later, COVID brought the business world to a halt, including all my clients, and I closed my business. I went on unemployment. My wife's lawyer dragged me back into court. I had the receipts for my unemployment checks. The judge yelled at me for closing my business, but I explained that I hadn't shut it down. COVID had by putting my clients out of business. I stopped making the payments on her Mercedes. The monthly payments were more than my unemployment checks, I explained to the judge. You can forget the mortgage payments on her extravagantly expensive house. I didn't have anywheres near the money to make those payments. I wasn't done yet with John, but I had to wait until after my divorce was final. Then I arranged an appointment at an IRS office and explained that John offered to help us cheat on our taxes and I had refused. I also explained that my wife ran off with him and I really wanted to hurt him, but I wasn't lying about his offer to help us cheat the IRS. With the divorce final, I restarted my business now that COVID had ended, or at least subsided. I wasn't earning as much as before, but since I no longer supported a libidinous luxury-loving lover, it was more than enough for me. The IRS not only conducted an audit, but served John with search warrants for his house, office, and cars. They found $250,000 in cash in the trunk of the Chevy in his garage. He had stolen all that money from his various clients. He was indicted for fraud, grand larceny, and tax evasion. John had one surprise for the IRS boys. He had religiously paid all the taxes due on the money he stole. The IRS dropped the charge on tax evasion, but he was found guilty of a slew of other charges and sentenced to 10 years in prison. You never want to mess with the IRS or a jealous husband. Dear listeners, sending loads of love to Ronald Burns for his contribution, and to all our listeners, thank you for being part of this literary journey with us. You can check out Ron's work at Amazon, and we have shared the links in the description box below. And if you want to share your work with us, please send your work at the email mentioned in the description box, and we will publish it for our listeners at Lost Love Chronicles. Please share your thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.